A little girl, frail in a faded dress, presses her hands against a trash bin, her eyes filled with tears as the wind howls around her. Behind her, a drunken man's shadow looms, while from the distance a figure in a police coat steps forward, a German shepherd at his side, eyes blazing with loyalty. The silence breaks into a heartbeat of tension. This is not just about survival, but about love, justice, and the meaning of family. Before we begin, tell us in the comments, where are you watching from today? Don't forget to subscribe for more stories of courage and hope. Wishing you a beautiful day ahead. The wind carried a biting chill through the streets of Millbrook, a small Midwestern town whose brick storefronts and faded billboards leaned tiredly into the cold. It was late February, the kind of month when the sky turned an iron gray long before dusk, and the air smelled of salt, coal smoke, and the promise of more snow. Icicles clung to the gutters of old houses, and the street lamps flickered reluctantly against the dimming light. In this brittle winter atmosphere, silence could feel heavier than noise, wrapping the town in a kind of uneasy stillness that only the sound of footsteps crunching over ice could disturb. Behind the peeling door of a ground-floor apartment, that silence was broken nightly by shouting, the slam of glass bottles, and the sound of a little girl trying not to cry too loudly. Sophie Miller was 8 years old, small for her age, her frame thinned by months of poor meals and restless nights. She had chestnut brown hair that tumbled into tangles around her pale face, and her storm gray eyes, once bright, now looked dulled, shaded by the kind of shadows a child should never know. Her mother, Laura, had passed away during childbirth 2 winters earlier, and the baby had not survived. Since then, Sophie had been left to the care of her stepfather, Victor Hale. She often pressed her thin hands against the hem of her faded white dress, the fabric worn so threadbare that seams looked ready to split. Her cheeks were hollow and her lips chapped, but what defined her most was the mixture of fear and endurance in her eyes, the knowledge that she could not fight back, but she could survive. Sophie had developed a quietness beyond her years, the kind that made her cautious and wary of every sound in the apartment. Victor Hale, her stepfather, was 40 years old, heavy-set, with a thick neck and a face that had once been boyishly handsome, but was now bloated and red from years of drinking. His hair was black streaked with early gray, cut unevenly, as if he no longer cared to visit a barber. His clothes always smelled of stale liquor and cigarette smoke, his shirt stained with grease from takeout meals. Victor had once worked in a warehouse on the edge of town, but after gambling debts piled up and his temper grew violent, he lost the job. Now, his life had become an endless cycle of drinking at the tavern, shouting at neighbors, and sinking further into bitterness. He carried the air of a man who believed the world had cheated him, and he took that grievance out on the smallest, most defenseless person under his roof, Sophie. To Victor, she was not family, not a reminder of Laura's kindness, but an unwanted burden. His cruelty did not explode in spectacular rage each day. Rather, it simmered steadily, a meanness of spirit that showed itself in every shove, every sneer, every bowl of watery porridge shoved across the table. That evening, the wooden door of the apartment screeched as Victor shoved it open, the sound echoing down the narrow hallway lined with peeling wallpaper. The smell inside was damp, a mix of mildew and cigarette ash ground into the carpet. Victor staggered in, clutching a half-empty bottle of bourbon, his bulky frame leaning to one side. His mouth sagged open in a half-snore, half-growl, and his bloodshot eyes fixed on Sophie, who sat curled against the wall with her knees drawn up, a small frayed blanket clutched around her shoulders. Without speaking, he hurled the bottle toward the floor, glass shattering into the corner, shards scattering like ice on the tiles. "You think I've got food for you?" he barked, his voice thick with drink. "Get up. Out. Go fetch something." The trash bin still got scraps from the diner down the block. Sophie's stomach tightened with hunger, a dull ache that had haunted her for days. She wanted to protest, to whisper that she was tired, that she was too cold to go outside again. But she knew hesitation would only bring a sharp blow from Victor's hand. She pressed her lips together and rose, trembling. Tears threatened, but she forced them down. She had learned not to give him the satisfaction of seeing her cry too quickly. Her small body slid across the floor as he shoved her toward the door. Outside, the air cut into her thin arms and legs. the hem of her dress snapping against her knees. She walked slowly toward the corner where the green trash bin stood, the snow around it blackened with soot, the smell of rot curling into her nostrils. From across the street, unseen in the dusk, a pair of amber eyes watched. Valor, a 6-year-old German shepherd, with a coat of black and sable fur, thick enough to withstand the cold, crouched near the shadow of a fence. His body was strong, his muscles coiled with alertness, yet his gaze carried intelligence rather than menace. He was trained to read distress, to stand between harm and the innocent. Beside him, his handler and closest companion, Officer Daniel Cross, leaned against the hood of a patrol car, scribbling notes from a long day. Daniel was 38 years old, tall and broad-shouldered, with short dark hair streaked with gray at the temples. His hazel eyes were sharp, though weariness clung to them like an old friend. He wore a Navy police uniform beneath a heavy winter coat, the badge glinting faintly in the streetlight. His posture was steady, the stance of a man accustomed to standing firm in the face of storms. Yet inside him was a quiet fracture, the memory of a wife lost to a car accident 3 years earlier and a child he never got to meet. That loss had carved silence into him, a silence he carried home each night like a second uniform. His colleagues described him as principled, even stubborn, the kind of man who refused to cut corners. But neighbors who saw him at the grocery store noted his polite nods, his soft words, and the sadness that never quite left his eyes. That night, when Daniel glanced up from his notebook and saw the little girl stumbling toward the trash bin, her thin dress whipping in the wind, his chest tightened. He had seen poverty before, neglect too, but something about the way she trembled, about the desperate way she reached toward the bin, struck deeper than mere duty. Valor let out a low growl, sensing his handler's sudden focus. Across the street, Victor's shadow loomed by the door, his voice rough and commanding. "Hurry up! Don't make me wait all night!" Sophie bent down, her small hands hovering above greasy containers and rotting scrappies, her face twisting as she fought the nausea rising in her throat. She whispered softly, almost to herself, if Mom were alive, she would never let this happen. Daniel's hand stilled on the notebook. For a moment, time seemed to stop. In the bleakness of winter, in the forgotten corners of Millbrook, a silent vow began to form in his heart. This was not a child he could leave to the dark. Valor stood, ears pricked, tail stiff, ready to move. The story that would change all their lives had just begun. The air around the trash bin stung with the sharp tang of spoiled food and winter frost, and Sophie's thin hands trembled as she reached into the bin, pulling away the lid with all the strength her frail body could muster. Greasy wrappers and hardened crusts of pizza slid against her fingers, leaving stains that would cling no matter how many times she scrubbed them. Behind her, Victor leaned against the doorway, a dark silhouette framed by the yellow glow of the apartment light, his bulk filling the space like a wall that Sophie could never climb. His voice cracked the night like a whip, sharp with liquor. "Faster, you little rat! Don't make me stand out here all night for your whining." Sophie shivered, not from the cold, but from the fear that seeped into her bones, knowing the back of his hand could strike at any second. She bent deeper into the bin, her lips moving with a silent plea. "Mom, please help me." Across the street, Officer Daniel Cross felt the muscles in his jaw tighten. His instincts as a cop told him to observe, to gather, to wait for the right moment. But his heart, the broken heart that had carried grief for 3 long years, pushed against his training. Next to him, Valor shifted, the dog's amber eyes fixed on Sophie, a low growl rumbling in his chest, as if he too understood the cruelty unfolding. Daniel exhaled, placed his notebook on the hood of the patrol car, and murmured softly, "Easy, boy. We'll handle this." He pulled his coat tighter against the cold and crossed the street, his boots crunching over salt and snow. Victor noticed him immediately, straightening slightly, suspicion flickering across his drunken face. "What do you want, officer?" he slurred, his words dragging. His cheeks were flushed crimson from alcohol, and the stench of bourbon rolled from him like a fog. Sophie froze, her small body stiff with alarm, torn between the instinct to run and the hope that someone, anyone, might save her. Daniel's hazel eyes locked on hers, and in that single glance, he saw desperation so raw it made his chest ache. He crouched slightly, lowering his voice. "It's okay, sweetheart." "You don't have to do this," Victor scoffed, staggering forward, pointing a thick finger at Daniel. "She's my stepkid. None of your business. She's lazy, eats more than she's worth. I told her if she wants food, she can find it." His words rolled with venom, each one a defense not of love, but of ownership. Daniel's voice grew firmer, the steel of authority returning. "Forcing a child to dig through garbage isn't parenting. Step inside, mister. Hail. We need to talk." Valor took a step closer, fur bristling, his presence commanding in the way only a German shepherd could be. A silent wall of loyalty and warning. Sophie, still clutching the greasy container she had pulled from the bin, looked up at Daniel with wide gray eyes. Her lips trembled as she whispered, "Please don't let him hit me." The words, fragile as smoke, cut through the night. Daniel felt something shift inside him, a weight he hadn't allowed himself to carry since the day he buried his wife. He extended a hand to Sophie, his voice soft but steady. "You're safe now?" The hallway light above the apartment flickered, and a neighbor's door opened with a squeak. Mrs. Harriet Green, a woman in her late 50s with a tall, angular frame and sharp cheekbones, peered out. She wore a faded housecoat, her silver hair pulled into a loose bun. Harriet had lived in the building for decades, known among tenants for her blunt tongue and weary kindness. She had watched Victor's descent with silent disapproval, but fear of his temper had kept her quiet. Still, seeing Sophie out in the snow stirred guilt that pressed lines deeper into her face. "Officer," she called, her voice hesitant. "I've heard things. That man shouts at her every night. Maybe it's time someone stepped in." Her eyes darted nervously toward Victor, but she didn't retreat. Daniel nodded, grateful for even this small courage. Victor, enraged by her words, lunged toward Sophie, his hand raised. Before he could touch her, Valor shot forward with a bark that cracked like thunder. The dog planted himself between Sophie and Victor, teeth bared, body taut with power. Victor stumbled back, startled, muttering curses. Daniel moved quickly, his hand resting near his holster, though he didn't draw. "That's enough. Step away, hail." His voice carried authority, the kind that left no room for argument. Sophie clutched Daniel's coat sleeve, her small fingers digging into the fabric as if it were a lifeline. For the first time in years, she felt the presence of someone who would not turn away. Daniel placed a steadying hand on her shoulder, guiding her gently. "We're going to the car, Sophie. You'll be warm there inside the patrol car." Sophie sat curled on the seat, Valor pressing close against her legs, his warmth a shield against the cold. She stroked the dog's fur with trembling fingers, whispering, "He's so brave, like he knows." Daniel glanced at her in the rearview mirror, his expression softening. He does know. That's what he's trained for, to protect. He thought of the nights Valor had sat silently by his side when grief made sleep impossible, the quiet comfort of an animal who never judged, only stayed. As Daniel pulled away from the curb, Victor shouted behind them, his voice echoing through the alley. "You'll pay for this, Cross! She's mine! You hear me? Mine!" The words rolled after them, but Daniel kept his eyes on the road, jaw clenched. He had seen men like Victor before, drunk on power, hollowed by bitterness. He knew the fight ahead would not be easy, but looking at Sophie's reflection in the mirror, he also knew retreat was no longer an option. They drove through Millbrook's silent streets, past shuttered shops and flickering neon signs. Snow fell lightly, dusting the windshield, as if the town itself were holding its breath. Daniel thought of the paperwork, the investigations, the battles in court that would surely follow. But for now, what mattered was that Sophie was not outside in the cold, not digging through refuse while the man who should have protected her sneered. Sophie leaned her head against the window, exhaustion pulling at her. "Do I have to go back?" she asked softly, fear lacing her voice. Daniel shook his head, his voice steady. "Not tonight. Not while I'm here." She closed her eyes, a faint relief crossing her face, though shadows of doubt still lingered. Beside her, Valor rested his head on her lap, a silent vow of protection. For Daniel, the night carried a strange echo of memory, the nights after his wife's funeral, when silence pressed too heavy against the walls of his empty house. He had learned to move through duty, through routine, but not through healing. And now, sitting in a patrol car with a trembling child and a loyal dog, he wondered if fate had given him a chance to try again, not for himself, but for someone who still had a future. The hospital lights glowed ahead, warm against the winter sky. Daniel steered toward them, the hum of the engine steady, the path clear. He knew this was only the beginning, but beginnings mattered. Sophie stirred slightly, murmuring as she drifted into uneasy sleep, "Thank you, mister." Daniel swallowed hard, his voice almost a whisper. "You're safe, Sophie. I promise." The hospital on the north end of Millbrook was not large, just 3 stories of pale brick, with a glass entrance that reflected the icy glow of street lamps. But in the stillness of a winter night, it radiated warmth like a lighthouse against the dark. The automatic doors slid open with a hush, letting in a rush of cold air as Officer Daniel Cross stepped inside, carrying Sophie Miller close to his chest. She was half asleep, her small frame trembling against him, her thin arms wrapped tightly around his coat. At his side trotted Valor, the German shepherd, his fur dusted with snowflakes, paws leaving damp marks on the hospital's polished floor. Valor's ears flicked constantly, alert to every sound, yet his amber eyes stayed focused on Sophie, as if he understood that she was now his charge. Behind the reception desk sat a nurse in her 30s named Marlene Cooper. Marlene had round cheeks, tired hazel eyes, and curly blonde hair pinned back with a blue clip. She had worked the night shift for almost 7 years, balancing her professional calm with the exhaustion of raising 2 children alone. Her husband had left when the youngest was still in diapers, and since then, she had grown both tougher and more empathetic, knowing intimately the weight of responsibility. She glanced up from her paperwork, startled by the sight of the officer, the dog, and the limp child. "Officer Cross?" she asked, recognizing him from prior patrols near the hospital. Her voice was brisk but gentle. "What happened?" Daniel lowered Sophie gently onto a wheelchair Marlene wheeled over. "She's malnourished, bruised, cold. She needs a doctor right away," he said, his voice clipped, but beneath it was a current of worry. Marlene nodded and picked up the phone, her fingers quick on the buttons. Within moments, another figure appeared from the hallway. A woman in her early 40s, tall and willowy, with auburn hair cut neatly to her shoulders and steel blue eyes that missed nothing. This was Dr. Caroline Hughes, the hospital's pediatric specialist. She wore a white coat over dark slacks and a green sweater, her stethoscope looped neatly around her neck. Caroline's reputation in Millbrook was one of fierce dedication. Having grown up in a family of coal miners where medical care was scarce, she had watched her younger brother die of pneumonia when she was 12, a tragedy that had imprinted on her so deeply she had sworn to dedicate her life to children's health. That early loss had shaped her personality, compassionate to those who suffered, unyielding against those who caused harm. She approached Sophie quickly, her expression softening as she knelt to the child's level. "Sweetheart, my name is Dr. Hughes. You're safe here. We're going to take care of you." Sophie blinked up at her, her gray eyes glassy with exhaustion, lips parted as though she wanted to speak but didn't trust the words. Valor pressed his nose against Sophie's knee, and she managed to lift one trembling hand to touch his fur. Caroline glanced at Daniel. "Where did you find her?" she asked, her voice even but edged with concern. Daniel hesitated only a moment. "Her stepfather forced her to dig through garbage. She's been neglected for a long time. I couldn't leave her there." Caroline's jaw tightened. She had seen this before, too many times, but the sight never grew easier. She signaled to 2 nurses to wheel Sophie toward the exam room. Daniel followed, Valor padding silently at his side. Inside the small room, bright with fluorescent light, Sophie was lifted gently onto a narrow bed. Caroline checked her vitals with steady hands, murmuring reassurances as she worked. "Pulse is weak, weight dangerously low, signs of prolonged malnutrition," she muttered, making notes on a chart. Sophie flinched at the blood pressure cuff tightening around her arm, and Caroline leaned close. "It's just a hug from the machine, sweetheart. Nothing scary." Slowly, Sophie's shoulders relaxed. While the nurses began warming IV fluids, Caroline turned back to Daniel. "She needs more than medical care. She needs safety. If the stepfather comes here, I'll need hospital security to be ready. Daniel nodded grimly. If he shows up, I'll handle it. His hand drifted unconsciously to Valor's head, and the dog leaned into the touch. As they worked, Sophie's eyes flickered open again. She whispered hoarsely, "Am I going back?" The words were thin, but they pierced the air. Daniel knelt beside her bed, meeting her gaze directly. "Not tonight. Not while I'm here." Something in his tone, firm, unshakable, caused Sophie's lips to tremble, and for the first time in days, she closed her eyes, not in fear, but in fragile trust. Meanwhile, in the hospital corridor, another figure appeared. Officer Maria Lopez, a colleague of Daniel's. Maria was 35, with dark hair braided neatly down her back, olive skin, and sharp brown eyes that radiated determination. She wore a heavy winter police coat over her uniform, her badge gleaming under the harsh hallway lights. Maria had grown up in a rough neighborhood of Chicago, where she had seen too many children fall through the cracks of the system, and she had joined law enforcement determined to make a difference. She had always admired Daniel's integrity, even when others called him stubborn, and tonight she had been dispatched when word reached the station of Daniel's unusual call. "Daniel," she said, striding up, her voice both urgent and low. "I heard about Hale. He's already stirring trouble, shouting about how you kidnapped his stepdaughter. He's drunk and loud. If he comes here, it won't just be noise. It'll be a scene." Daniel exhaled, rubbing the bridge of his nose. "Of course he is." Maria's eyes flicked past him to Sophie on the bed. Valor curled like a guardian at her side. Something softened in her expression. "She looks like she hasn't had a safe day in years." Inside the room, Caroline finished her preliminary notes and looked up. "She'll need at least a few days here. Severe malnutrition, possible bacterial infection from unsanitary food. I'll run labs, but we'll stabilize her first." She paused, then added, "Officer Cross, if you're willing, you'll need to file immediate protective custody paperwork. If she goes back to him, she won't survive the winter." Daniel's throat tightened as he nodded. "I'll do it tonight." The night deepened outside, snow falling heavier now, blanketing the hospital parking lot in white. In the quiet of the room, Sophie's breathing evened out as the IV dripped steadily. Valor remained at her side, head resting on the edge of the bed, his amber eyes never straying from the child's fragile form. Maria leaned against the wall, arms crossed, watching Daniel. "You've taken on something big," she said softly. "Cases like this, they can eat a man alive. You sure you're ready?" Daniel looked at Sophie, at the faint rise and fall of her chest, and then at Valor, steady as ever. "I wasn't ready to bury my wife, Maria. I wasn't ready to live in silence all these years, but I'm ready for this. She deserves better." For the first time that night, Maria smiled faintly, a flash of warmth across her stern face. "Then she's lucky you found her." The words hung in the air like a quiet blessing, a fragile thread of hope weaving itself into the sterile white of the hospital room. Outside, the storm pressed on, but within those walls, a new promise had begun to take root. The snowstorm that had begun as a gentle curtain of flakes grew heavier by morning, covering Millbrook in white silence. Streets were muffled beneath the weight, and even the neon signs of downtown diners seemed subdued. Inside the hospital, the sterile hum of machines kept steady, punctuated only by the occasional footsteps of nurses making their rounds. Officer Daniel Cross sat in a hard-backed chair near Sophie's bed, his broad shoulders slumped with fatigue, but his hazel eyes still sharp, watching every subtle change in the child's breathing. Valor lay curled on the floor, his black and sable coat rising and falling in calm rhythm, though his ears flicked at every sound in the corridor, never fully at rest. Sophie stirred, her storm-gray eyes opening slowly. She looked around the room, momentarily confused, then found Daniel's steady gaze. For a moment, fear flickered across her face before fading into fragile relief. She whispered, "You stayed." Daniel nodded, leaning forward slightly. "I told you I would. And I will." She closed her eyes again, the corners of her lips tugging into the faintest shadow of a smile. Beyond the warmth of that room, however, another story was unfolding across town. Victor Hale, hungover but still burning with fury, staggered into a narrow office above a pawn shop. The room smelled of cheap cigars and coffee long gone cold. At a desk, cluttered with legal pads and folders, sat Richard Collins, a lawyer in his late 40s. Collins was lean, with thinning brown hair combed slickly back and small, calculating eyes hidden behind rimless glasses. His suits were always expensive, but just slightly out of fashion, signaling a man who wanted to appear more powerful than he was. His reputation in Millbrook was notorious. He had a gift for twisting the law to serve clients who could pay, or, failing that, who could feed his greed in other ways. Victor dropped heavily into the chair opposite him, his unshaven face pale under the fluorescent light. "That cop stole her," he snarled, his voice hoarse. "Dragged her right out from under me. I want her back, and I want him ruined." Collins folded his hands, regarding Victor like a vulture circling carrion. "You've been careless, Victor. The police have reports. Witnesses may speak against you. But—" his voice dropped, oily and deliberate. "Public opinion can be far more dangerous than evidence. If the town believes Officer Cross kidnapped your stepdaughter, the law will have to follow." Victor sneered. "So make them believe it." Collins tapped his pen against the desk, eyes narrowing. "We'll craft a narrative. A grieving widower cop, lonely, unstable, takes a girl he barely knows. You'll give a statement. I'll feed it to the right journalist. One headline, and his badge will hang by a thread." He smiled thinly, the kind of smile that never reached his eyes. "People trust scandal more than truth." Meanwhile, back at the hospital, Maria Lopez returned mid-morning with paperwork for emergency protective custody. She entered the room briskly, shaking snow from her coat. Maria's expression was serious, but beneath her sharp exterior was a quiet warmth. She approached Sophie gently, crouching to meet her eye level. "Sophie, my name is Maria. I work with Officer Cross. We're here to keep you safe, okay?" Sophie studied her warily before nodding faintly, her thin hands clutching the blanket closer around her. Valor shifted, resting his head near Sophie's foot, as if to confirm the truth in Maria's words. As Maria explained the legal process to Daniel, another figure entered. Thomas Blake, a hospital security officer. Thomas was in his early 50s, tall and broad-shouldered, with salt and pepper hair and a trim beard. His presence carried both authority and kindness. Years earlier, he had worked as a sheriff's deputy before retiring to take the quieter job of hospital security. He had seen enough in his years to understand danger when it was coming. "Cross," he said in a gravelly but calm voice. "We've had calls. Hale's been asking around, making noise. If he shows up here, we'll stop him at the door. But you should be ready. Men like him don't stop with words." Daniel nodded his thanks. The hours slipped by with slow tension. Sophie rested, but every now and then she startled awake, eyes wide as if expecting Victor to appear. Daniel stayed close, speaking softly to calm her, while Valor never moved far from her side. Outside the room, Maria checked her phone, frowning as a notification appeared. She showed it to Daniel, a breaking article from a local news blog. The headline screamed, "Local officer accused of kidnapping stepdaughter from grieving father." A photo of Daniel in uniform, pulled from an old press release, was plastered above the text. Daniel's face hardened. "Collins," he muttered. Maria cursed under her breath. "He's already at work." "This is going to complicate everything." Daniel looked at Sophie, then at Valor, then back at Maria. "Let them write. The truth will come out. But until then, we protect her." His words carried the weight of a man ready to stand against a tide. That evening, Caroline Hughes returned to check on Sophie. The doctor's steel-blue eyes softened as she adjusted the IV and gently touched Sophie's wrist. "She's responding to fluids, but she needs calm. Stress can undo all this progress." Caroline straightened, looking at Daniel. "If the press starts circling, you'll need to shield her from it. Children pick up more than we think." Daniel inclined his head, his voice quiet. "She's already carried too much. She won't carry this." Later, when Sophie fell asleep again, Maria leaned against the wall, watching Daniel stroke Valor's fur absent-mindedly. "You know, Daniel," she said softly, taking her in, fighting Collins, facing Hale, "this isn't just about the job anymore. It's personal." Daniel's hazel eyes lifted, weary but resolute. It became personal the moment I saw her hands in that trash bin. Maria studied him for a moment, then gave a rare smile. Then you'd better be ready, because they'll come at you with everything outside. The storm raged, burying Millbrook deeper in white silence. In the heart of the hospital, though, a fragile alliance was forming. An officer, a colleague, a doctor, and a loyal dog, all bound by the determination to protect a child whose life had been neglected too long. Unseen to them, in a smoky office across town, Collins drafted his next moves while Victor fumed and cursed. The trap was being laid, the web tightening. Yet within the sterile white walls of the hospital, a seed of hope had already taken root, and Daniel knew one thing with certainty. He would not let it be torn away. The courthouse in Millbrook stood like a relic from another era, its stone columns streaked with years of weather, its wooden doors carved with cracks that whispered of decades of trials and verdicts. On this particular morning, the air outside was sharp with frost, citizens clustering in scarves and heavy coats as they drifted toward the steps. Reporters lined the entrance, their cameras flashing eagerly as whispers spread about the case of the police officer accused of kidnapping a little girl. Headlines had already shaped a story before a single word was spoken under oath. Inside, the atmosphere was taut. The courtroom smelled faintly of polished oak and ink, warmed slightly by the crackling radiator near the judge's bench. Officer Daniel Cross sat at the defendant's table, his broad frame rigid, jaw clenched. He wore his Navy uniform pressed sharply, his badge gleaming under the overhead lights, not as a boast, but as a reminder of who he was. Beside him sat his attorney, Linda Graves, a woman in her late 40s with sharp cheekbones, shoulder-length black hair streaked with silver, and piercing green eyes. Linda was well known in Millbrook's legal circles. Once a fierce public defender who had lost a brother to police brutality, she carried a nuanced perspective. Her belief in justice was carved from both anger and compassion, and her presence in the courtroom carried a gravity that reassured Daniel even as the weight of accusation pressed down on him. On the opposite side sat Richard Collins, smug in a gray tailored suit, his glasses catching the light with every self-satisfied tilt of his head. Next to him was Victor Hale, face red with both anger and drink from the night before, though he had attempted to appear respectable in a wrinkled dress shirt and tie that hung loosely around his thick neck. His hands fidgeted constantly, tapping against the table, betraying his impatience. Judge Margaret O'Connor presided over the bench. In her mid-50s, with auburn hair pinned into a tight bun, and a presence that commanded attention, she was known throughout the county as both fair and unyielding. She had grown up the daughter of a factory worker, and had worked her way through law school on scholarships and night jobs. Her eyes, steel gray and unblinking, swept the courtroom like searchlights, weighing every gesture, every word. She rapped her gavel once, the sound echoing like thunder, and called the court to order. The first witness called was Victor Hale. He stumbled slightly as he made his way to the stand, his heavy body barely fitting into the witness chair. Collins straightened his papers and asked smoothly, "Mr. Hale, please tell the court what happened the night your stepdaughter was taken." Victor launched into his story, voice dramatic, painting himself as a devoted father who had been unjustly robbed of his child by a grieving, unstable officer. His words dripped with false sorrow. "I was only trying to feed her, to give her structure. Officer Cross stormed in and stole her away. He even wiped at his eye with a handkerchief, though no tear followed." Linda rose for cross-examination, her voice calm but firm. "Mr. Hale, is it true you've been arrested for disorderly conduct 6 times in the last 2 years? Victor shifted, his jaw tightening. "Irrelevant," he muttered. Linda pressed further. "And is it true that you are currently unemployed due to repeated intoxication on the job?" The murmur through the crowd grew louder. Victor's face darkened, but he forced himself to glare at Daniel rather than answer directly. Judge O'Connor raised her gavel slightly. "Mr. Hale, answer the question." His reply was clipped. "Yes, but that doesn't make me a bad guardian." Linda's green eyes narrowed. "Forcing a child to search garbage for food, does that make you a good guardian?" The silence that followed was deafening. Meanwhile, Sophie sat in a side room adjacent to the courtroom, accompanied by a social worker named Elaine Porter. Elaine was in her early 30s, slender with curly auburn hair that fell to her shoulders and warm brown eyes that carried both strength and gentleness. She had chosen this line of work after growing up with an abusive father herself, determined to be the safe harbor she never had. Elaine held Sophie's hand, whispering, "You don't have to be afraid. Just tell the truth. That's all anyone can ask." Sophie's storm-gray eyes flickered with fear, but she nodded faintly, her small body trembling in the oversized chair. Valor lay at her feet, his steady breathing grounding her. The court had permitted him to stay by her side, recognizing the bond and his role in calming her. When Sophie was led into the courtroom, the entire space seemed to shift. The small figure in a simple dress, hair neatly combed by a nurse that morning, drew every eye. She clutched the hem nervously but walked with Valor at her side, her hand gripping his collar for courage. Judge O'Connor softened almost imperceptibly as she looked down at the child. "Miss Miller, do you understand why you are here today?" Sophie nodded, her voice a faint whisper. "To tell what happened." Collins began his questioning, his voice falsely gentle, like syrup hiding poison. "Sophie, isn't it true that Officer Cross frightened you when he took you from your home?" Sophie glanced at Daniel, then at Valor, then back at Collins. Her lips trembled. "No, he helped me." Collins frowned. "But didn't your stepfather care for you? Didn't he provide food?" Sophie's small hands tightened on Valor's fur, her eyes filling with tears. Her voice cracked but grew stronger with each word. "He made me dig in trash. He yelled. He drank. He hurt me." The room fell silent. Even the reporters lowered their pens for a moment. Judge O'Connor leaned forward, her voice firm but not unkind. "Thank you, Sophie. You've done very well." Sophie blinked, surprised at the kindness, then allowed Elaine to guide her back to the adjoining room, Valor trotting close behind. As murmurs rippled through the courtroom, Collins tried to recover, calling on a journalist named Ethan Voss to testify. Ethan was a man in his late 20s, slim with slicked-back blonde hair and an ever-present smirk. Known for his sensationalist style, he thrived on half-truths and scandal. He spoke of the article he had published, claiming multiple anonymous sources had confirmed Daniel's instability. Linda's cross-examination dismantled him piece by piece. "Mr. Voss, were you paid by Richard Collins for this story?" His smirk faltered, his pale face flushing. He stammered, "Compensation for research." The judge's eyes narrowed, and whispers surged again through the gallery. By the end of the day, the weight of testimony hung thick in the room. Judge O'Connor did not deliver a final verdict yet, but her sharp gaze lingered longest on Daniel, then on Victor. As if already piecing the puzzle, she adjourned court with a promise to reconvene after further evidence was reviewed. Reporters spilled out onto the snowy steps, their cameras flashing as the story continued to grow. Inside, Daniel remained seated, exhaustion pulling at him. Maria touched his shoulder lightly, her voice low. "You held your ground." And Sophie? She was braver than anyone expected. Daniel's hazel eyes softened. She shouldn't have had to be brave. Not like that. Outside, the storm eased, leaving behind a fragile light on the courthouse steps. Yet the battle was far from over. Daniel knew Collins would strike again, Victor would not retreat, and the town's whispers would continue. But Sophie had spoken her truth, and that truth had echoed louder than lies. The snow had softened by evening, coating Millbrook's streets in a muted hush. The courthouse steps, which had been buzzing with reporters earlier, were now nearly empty save for a few stray photographers snapping last shots of the day. Daniel Cross stepped out with Maria Lopez by his side, his breath visible in the cold air. Behind him walked Sophie, clutching Valor's leash with both hands, her storm-gray eyes darting nervously at the flash of cameras. Elaine Porter hovered protectively near her, shielding the girl from intrusive questions. Daniel's heart tightened as he watched Sophie's small frame shrink under the weight of unwanted attention. He lowered his broad body slightly, placing himself between her and the lingering reporters. "No questions today," he said firmly, his voice carrying the authority of years in uniform. The reporters grumbled but backed off, their lenses finding easier prey elsewhere. Sophie's grip on Valor loosened, and she whispered to the dog, "You scare them away." Valor's amber eyes flicked up at her, his calm expression enough to steady her small shoulders. Across town, in a dimly lit tavern that smelled of stale beer and smoke, Victor Hale brooded over a glass half filled with whiskey. His large frame slouched forward, his tie pulled loose, his shirt stained at the collar. Rage and humiliation burned through him as he replayed Sophie's testimony in his mind. He slammed his fist on the table, startling a waitress who scurried past. "She turned against me," he growled to Collins, who sat across from him. Collins looked unchanged, suit still neat, glasses reflecting the weak glow of neon beer signs. His voice was smooth, almost amused. "Children are unreliable witnesses. Courts know that. But the problem, Victor, is not the girl. It's the officer. Cross has managed to paint himself as a savior. If we don't strike harder, you'll lose what little leverage you have." Victor scowled. "So what's your plan?" Collins leaned forward, his thin fingers steepled. "Public pressure. We leak more stories. We make Cross look unstable, haunted by grief from his wife's death. People will start to question whether he's fit to care for a child. I know just the person to help. An old contact in Child Protective Services who owes me favors." He smiled coldly. "Once the machinery of bureaucracy turns, it's difficult to stop." Back at Daniel's modest home, the mood was different. His house was a 2-story colonial on the edge of town, painted pale blue, its front porch sagging slightly with age. It had felt unbearably empty since his wife's passing, but tonight, for the first time, it carried a different energy. Sophie stepped hesitantly into the living room, her small figure dwarfed by the space. Her eyes scanned the furniture, the worn leather couch, the framed photos on the mantel, the muted colors of a house once full of laughter. She paused at a picture of a smiling woman with long dark hair, Daniel's late wife, Emily. "Is that her?" Sophie asked softly. Daniel's throat tightened. "Yes, Emily. She loved kids." Sophie studied the photo for a moment, then turned away, perhaps sensing the weight behind his words. Maria had come along to help Sophie settle in, her presence both practical and comforting. She pulled off her gloves, her voice warm but firm. "Sophie, this is your safe place now. No one comes in unless Daniel says so." She crouched to meet Sophie's eyes, her braid slipping forward over her shoulder. "You're not alone anymore." Sophie nodded, though doubt lingered in the shadows of her face. That evening, Daniel cooked for the first time in weeks. The smell of chicken soup filled the kitchen, steam curling against the frosted windows. Valor lay stretched out on the floor, his nose twitching at the scent, his tail thumping lazily whenever Sophie giggled at his attempts to sneak closer to the stove. Sophie sat at the table, her thin frame wrapped in a borrowed sweater that nearly swallowed her. She stared at the bowl before her, then looked at Daniel uncertainly. "Do I have to save some, in case there's no food tomorrow?" Her question cut into the room like glass. Daniel knelt beside her, his hazel eyes steady. "You never have to hide food here. There will always be more tomorrow." For a long moment she searched his face, and finally she dipped her spoon into the soup. Valor inched closer, and she laughed softly, breaking off a small piece of bread for him. Later that night, after Maria left, Daniel prepared the guest room for Sophie. It had once been his wife's office, the desk cleared now to make space for a small bed covered with fresh sheets. He set a soft night lamp shaped like a star on the nightstand. Sophie stood in the doorway, clutching Valor's leash, her gray eyes wide. "Is this really mine?" Daniel smiled gently, though his heart ached. "It's yours as long as you need it." Sophie stepped inside, ran her hand along the quilt, then hugged Valor tightly. "We're safe," she whispered into his fur. Meanwhile, back at the tavern, Collins excused himself from Victor's drunken ranting to make a call. His contact, a woman named Patricia Kane, answered on the second ring. Patricia was a social worker in her 40s, broad-shouldered with short-cropped hair, and a reputation for following procedure to the letter. Years earlier, Collins had helped her brother avoid jail time after a fraud case, and she still felt indebted. "What do you need, Richard?" she asked, her voice clipped. Collins leaned against the bar, lowering his tone. "I need you to review a file. Officer Daniel Cross has taken in a child without full authorization. If you open an investigation, it'll raise questions. Serious questions. Patricia hesitated, then sighed. I'll look into it. But, Richard, this is risky. He smiled thinly. Risk is my business. The night ended quietly in Daniel's house. Sophie, curled beneath the quilt, whispered one final word before sleep claimed her. Dad. It was barely audible, fragile as snow against glass, but it reached Daniel where he stood in the doorway. His chest tightened, tears pricking his eyes, but he said nothing, only turned off the light and let the silence hold them both. Across town, shadows lengthened as Collins tightened his net. The battle was no longer confined to the courtroom. It was moving into the spaces between law and rumor, truth and manipulation. But in the quiet of a once lonely house, a bond had begun to form, fragile yet unbreakable, like the first flicker of a fire in the dark. Morning came slowly to Millbrook, the sky a pale wash of gray, the snow on the ground crusted with ice that cracked beneath boots. In the modest colonial house at the edge of town, Daniel Cross brewed coffee while Valor stretched by the back door, his fur gleaming in the thin light. Sophie padded quietly into the kitchen, her hair tangled from sleep, clutching a blanket around her shoulders. She climbed onto a chair, her storm-gray eyes still heavy with dreams. Daniel slid a plate of scrambled eggs in front of her, and she blinked at it as if food on a warm plate were still a wonder. For a brief moment, the house felt like a home, but the knock on the front door broke the fragile calm. Daniel opened it to find Patricia Kane standing on the porch, bundled in a gray wool coat, a file tucked under her arm. Patricia was in her mid-40s, stocky, with short-cropped brown hair and glasses that lent her an air of severity. Her face bore the lines of someone who had seen too many homes fall apart, and her voice carried the clipped authority of bureaucracy. She introduced herself briskly. Mr. Cross, I'm with Child Protective Services. I need to speak with you about Sophie Miller. Daniel stepped aside reluctantly, his posture protective. Sophie shrank back in her chair, clutching Valor's collar. Patricia's gaze softened slightly as she noticed the child, but her professional mask held. She set her file on the table, flipping it open with precise movements. There have been concerns raised about the manner in which Sophie was removed from her home. I'm required to evaluate her current environment. Sophie's eyes widened in fear. She whispered, Are they taking me back? Daniel crouched beside her, his hazel eyes steady. No one's taking you anywhere without a fight. Patricia adjusted her glasses, her voice flat but not unkind. No decisions are made today. This is an evaluation. Valor growled softly, sensing Sophie's unease, until Daniel placed a calming hand on his head. As Patricia walked through the house, she noted every detail: the tidy living room, the photographs on the mantel, the small bedroom prepared for Sophie with its star-shaped nightlamp. She scribbled notes quickly, her expression difficult to read. Sophie trailed close behind Daniel, never letting go of Valor's fur. Later that morning, Daniel drove Sophie to school, for the first time since she'd been placed in his care. The building was a 2-story brick structure, with wide steps and a flagpole in front, its hallways echoing with chatter and lockers slamming. Sophie clung to his hand, reluctant to enter. The principal, Mrs. Eleanor Briggs, greeted them warmly. She was a tall woman in her 50s, with silver hair pulled into a bun, her round glasses perched low on her nose. Known for her fairness and her fierce protection of students, she had guided the school for nearly 2 decades. Officer Cross, she said, shaking his hand firmly. Sophie, welcome. You'll be safe here. Sophie's gray eyes studied her for a moment before giving a shy nod. Mrs. Briggs crouched slightly, her smile gentle. And Valor, he won't be in the classroom, but you can visit him during breaks. We'll find ways to help you both feel comfortable. The first day was not easy. In class, whispers followed Sophie, children curious about the girl who had appeared in the middle of the term with a police officer and a German shepherd. Some offered tentative smiles, but others snickered. At recess, a boy named Tyler, lanky with freckles and a mischievous grin, asked bluntly, Is it true your dad's not really your dad? Sophie froze, her lips trembling. Before she could answer, a girl named Jenny Lopez, Maria's niece, stepped forward. Jenny was 9, with dark braids and sharp brown eyes that mirrored her aunt's determination. Leave her alone, she snapped. She's my friend. Sophie's eyes widened at the word friend, and for the first time that day she allowed herself a tiny smile. Meanwhile, in town, Collins continued his quiet war. He met with Patricia over coffee at a corner diner, sliding a folded document across the table. Patricia's expression tightened as she glanced at it. "Richard, this is not how we do things," she said sharply. But Collins leaned back, his voice calm. "You owe me, Patricia. All I'm asking is that you highlight concerns, instability, questionable judgment. Nothing untrue, just selective." Patricia hesitated, her professional pride warring with old debts. Her fingers drummed against the table before she finally sighed. "I'll file a preliminary report, but the court will decide." Back at Daniel's house, the evening grew heavier. Sophie sat on the couch, Valor's head in her lap, while Daniel sifted through paperwork Maria had delivered from the station. "They're building a case," Maria said grimly, pacing the room. "Collins has leverage somewhere in CPS. You'll need airtight evidence if you want to keep custody." Her tone was sharp, but beneath it lay concern. She paused, glancing at Sophie. "And you'll need to prepare her." "This won't stop at one hearing." Sophie looked up, storm gray eyes wide. "Am I trouble?" "I don't mean to be." Daniel set the papers aside, kneeling before her. "You're not trouble. You're the reason I'm standing." "And I won't stop." Maria's stern expression softened, and she reached out, brushing Sophie's hair back gently. "He means that, kiddo." That night, after Sophie drifted into sleep, Daniel sat in the dim light of the kitchen, Valor curled at his feet. He thought of Emily, of the loneliness that had hollowed his house for years, and now of the fragile thread of hope Sophie had brought back. Outside, the snow fell steadily again, cloaking the town in silence. But Daniel knew the silence wouldn't last. Collins' shadow stretched further each day, and Patricia's report would soon determine more than just custody. It would decide Sophie's future. Still, as he rose to check on the girls sleeping safely in the next room, Daniel made a silent vow. Whatever battles lay ahead, they would face them together. The following week dawned clear but brittle, the sky a crystalline blue that offered no warmth against the icy wind. Millbrook looked deceptively peaceful under its white blanket, yet tension brewed beneath the surface. News had begun to ripple through the community. Patricia Kane's preliminary report had been leaked to the press. The headlines were damning, concerns raised over Officer Cross's custody of young girl. Daniel read the article at his kitchen table, the morning sun slicing through the blinds in harsh lines. His jaw tightened as he scanned the selective phrases. Questions about emotional stability, possible lack of long-term resources. Each line, stripped of context, painted him as a man unfit to care for Sophie. Across the table, Sophie sat with Valor curled protectively against her side, the dog's amber eyes locked on Daniel's shifting expression. Sophie's voice was barely a whisper. "They don't want me here, do they?" Daniel reached across, his calloused hand covering her small one. "Don't believe what you hear, kiddo. This house, this family, isn't going anywhere." In town, the ripple effect was immediate. At Millbrook Diner, a gathering spot for locals, conversations turned heated. On one side of the counter, Henry Calloway, a retired firefighter in his 60s with a thick mustache and a booming laugh, slammed his coffee mug down. "That officer's done more for this town than anyone. He saved that child. And they're trying to take her away? Nonsense." Across from him, Margaret Dean, a stern woman in her 70s with neatly curled gray hair and a reputation for gossip, shook her head. "Rules are rules, Henry. You can't just snatch up a child and call it family. The system exists for a reason." The diner's owner, Lucy Nguyen, a petite woman in her 40s with a calm voice and quick wit, tried to smooth things over. "Let's not tear the town apart over this." But it looks like lines are already being drawn. At the school, whispers followed Sophie again. Some parents had told their children to keep distance, fearing scandal, while others encouraged their kids to be kind. Jenny Lopez, steadfast and fiery, stayed at Sophie's side. During recess, she declared loudly, "She's my friend, and anyone who says otherwise can talk to me." Tyler, the freckled boy, muttered, "My dad says Officer Cross is dangerous." Sophie froze, her face pale, until Valor, allowed by special permission to wait near the playground fence, let out a low bark that made Tyler step back. Jenny smirked. "See? Even the dog knows you're wrong." Sophie managed a small, shaky smile, but the weight of judgment pressed on her shoulders. Meanwhile, Patricia Kane sat in her office surrounded by stacks of case files. The fluorescent light above her flickered, casting shadows across her tired face. She stared at her report, guilt gnawing at her. She was a woman who had built her career on discipline and adherence to protocol, but now she found herself entangled in Collins's web. The thought of Sophie's wide, fearful eyes haunted her, but the memory of her brother, the one Collins had once saved from prison, anchored her choices. She rubbed her temples, whispering, "I didn't say he was unfit. I just didn't say he was fit either." Her conscience battled with her debt, leaving her hollow. Daniel tried to stay ahead of the storm. He met with his lawyer, Linda Graves, in her office above the town square. The space smelled of old books and strong coffee, walls lined with legal tomes and family photographs. Linda, with her sharp green eyes and composed demeanor, tapped a pen against her desk. "The report isn't a verdict, Daniel. It's ammunition. Collins is using it to sway public opinion, but we can counter with evidence of stability. Financial records, testimony from colleagues, medical evaluations. We need to drown speculation with fact." She leaned forward, her voice low. "But we'll also need character witnesses. People the town respects." Daniel thought of Henry Calloway, of Lucy at the diner, of Dr. Caroline Hughes. He nodded grimly. "We'll give them the truth." That evening, Maria stopped by Daniel's home with groceries in her arms. She kicked the snow off her boots and entered with her usual brisk energy. "The town's buzzing," she reported. "Some folks are rallying behind you. Others think CPS should take Sophie away." She glanced at Sophie, who sat cross-legged on the rug, Valor's head resting in her lap as she read aloud from a children's book. Maria's sharp features softened. "She's better here than anywhere else. We'll prove it." But even as allies gathered, danger loomed. At the tavern, Victor Hale grew louder, fueled by whiskey and Collins' whispers. His face, ruddy and sagging, twisted with bitterness as he ranted to anyone who'd listen. "She's my blood. He stole her. And now the whole town thinks he's a hero." One man at the bar, Carl Jennings, a rough-looking mechanic in his 30s with a permanent scowl, nodded eagerly. Carl had his own history with Daniel. He'd been arrested for drunk driving by him years ago and never forgave it. "You tell me when, Victor. We'll make sure that cop doesn't look so perfect anymore." Victor's lips curled into a dangerous grin. By nightfall, the town felt divided in two. Some pinned flyers to telephone poles with words of support. "Protect Sophie. Protect truth." Others muttered in grocery aisles that Daniel had overstepped. At home, Daniel tucked Sophie into bed, pulling the quilt up to her chin. She looked at him with wide eyes. "What if they take me away?" Daniel swallowed hard, his voice steady, though his chest ached. "I won't let that happen." Not ever. Valor leapt onto the floor beside her bed, his massive body curling protectively. Sophie buried her face in the dog's fur, whispering, "Don't let them." Valor's tail thumped once, his silent vow echoing Daniel's own. In the darkness of the small colonial home, hope and fear collided. Outside, snow fell once again, cloaking the streets of Millbrook in quiet white. But within the town, the noise of division grew louder. The next battle would not be fought in courtrooms alone. It would be fought in the hearts and minds of neighbors, friends, and strangers deciding who to believe. The wind cut sharp through Millbrook's main street that Saturday afternoon, carrying with it the voices of a restless crowd. Word had spread that a rally would take place in front of the courthouse, ostensibly about community values, but everyone knew it was about Sophie Miller and Officer Daniel Cross. By noon, the square was crowded with townsfolk, their breath forming clouds in the winter air. Some carried handmade signs that read, "Protect Sophie" or "Justice for Families," while others clutched placards demanding, "Follow the law" and "No vigilante custody." Daniel had not wanted to bring Sophie, but Maria insisted that hiding would only feed suspicion, so he stood at the edge of the crowd, broad-shouldered in his navy coat, his badge tucked out of sight, but his presence unmistakable. Beside him, Sophie clung to Valor's collar, her small body dwarfed by the German shepherd's muscular frame. Valor stood tall, his black and silver fur bristling slightly, amber eyes scanning the crowd, as if he knew danger lurked beneath the chance. On the courthouse steps stood Mayor Judith Reynolds, a woman in her early 60s with a statuesque frame, neatly tailored wool coat, and a voice honed by decades in politics. Her iron-gray hair was pulled into a bun, and her piercing blue eyes swept the crowd as she raised a hand for quiet. Judith was respected, but not always loved. She valued order above sentiment, and her decisions were guided more by the town charter than by personal feeling. "We are gathered here," she began, her voice steady, "because a child's welfare is at the center of our community's conscience. We must balance compassion with the law." Her words drew murmurs, some nodding in agreement, others jeering. Henry Calloway, the retired firefighter, bellowed from the crowd, "That man saved her life." Margaret Dean retorted from another corner, "The system will decide." The tension thickened until a new voice cut through, Victor Hale, stumbling onto the steps. He looked disheveled in a threadbare jacket, his face flushed from both drink and fury. "That's my stepdaughter," he roared. "That officer stole her, and you all cheer him like a hero." His words ignited half the crowd, cheers and boos clashing like opposing storms. Before Daniel could move Sophie away, a reporter shoved through the throng. Ethan Voss, the young journalist with slicked-back blonde hair and an opportunistic smirk, had a cameraman trailing him. He thrust a microphone toward Sophie, crouching low to catch her frightened eyes. "Sophie, do you feel safe with Officer Cross? Do you miss your real family?" The question landed like a stone. Sophie froze, her storm-gray eyes wide, her lips trembling. Valor growled low, his body tense, and Daniel's hand shot out, pushing the microphone aside. "Back off," he said, voice steel. Ethan smirked wider, whispering loud enough for the camera, "Look at that temper, unstable, just as the—" A report said Maria appeared then, fierce as ever, stepping between the reporter and Sophie. Her dark braid swung over her shoulder as she glared. "You harass a child one more time, and I'll drag you out of here myself." The cameraman hesitated, sensing the crowd shifting, but Ethan grinned, pleased with the spectacle. From the opposite side of the square, a new figure stepped forward. Reverend Samuel Price, pastor of the local church, was a tall man in his late 50s with kind brown eyes and a calm presence that seemed to still the air around him. His salt and pepper beard framed a face weathered not by bitterness, but by years of listening to others' pain. He raised his hands. "Brothers and sisters, are we forgetting ourselves? This is a child we are speaking about, not a symbol for our divisions." His voice carried, soothing some of the tension, though not all. Mayor Reynolds seized the lull. "This matter is before the courts. Until then, let us not tear our town apart." She signaled for the rally to disperse. Slowly, the crowd began to break, though arguments lingered in small clusters. Victor was escorted away by police officers after shouting curses, and Ethan continued filming, narrating dramatically about the chaos in Millbrook. Daniel led Sophie and Valor toward the parking lot, Maria close behind. Sophie's hand was cold in his, her small frame trembling. "They all hate me," she whispered. Daniel crouched, his hazel eyes firm. "No, they're fighting because they don't know the truth yet. But we do. And that's enough." Valor pressed against Sophie's side, a silent wall of strength. That evening, back at the house, Daniel tried to create a semblance of normalcy. He built a fire in the living room, its crackle warming the shadows. Sophie curled on the couch with a blanket, Valor's head in her lap. Maria cooked a pot of chili, filling the air with rich spices. But even in the warmth, the weight of the day lingered. The phone rang, and Daniel answered to hear Patricia Kane's clipped voice. "Officer Cross, I've been asked to accelerate my report. The final hearing may be scheduled sooner than expected." Her tone wavered faintly as though regret slipped through her professionalism. Daniel's jaw tightened. "Then we'll be ready." After the call, Sophie looked at him with wide eyes. "Are they going to take me away tomorrow?" He sat beside her, pulling her close. "Not tomorrow, not ever, if I can help it." She leaned her head against his chest, whispering, "I believe you." Valor's tail thumped once, steady as a heartbeat. But across town, in the dim back room of the tavern, Collins met again with Victor and Carl Jennings, the mechanic with a grudge. Collins adjusted his tie, his eyes cold behind his glasses. The crowd today was a start. Now we press harder. By the time the next hearing comes, the town will see Cross not as a hero, but as a man unfit. Reckless and dangerous, Victor grinned, his teeth yellow in the low light. We'll bury him. The storm in Millbrook had only begun, and as the snow fell again that night, blanketing the streets in deceptive quiet, Daniel knew the hardest trial was still ahead, not just in court, but in the hearts of those around him. In the end, this story reminds us that the true miracles of God are often revealed through love, protection, and the quiet courage to do what is right. Just as the little girl found safety in the most unexpected place, we too can find God's hand guiding us through the darkest trials of daily life. Every act of kindness, every choice to protect the vulnerable, is proof that His miracles still walk among us. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who needs hope today. Leave a comment, and subscribe for more stories of faith and courage. May God bless you and your loved ones abundantly. And if you believe in the miracle of God's love, type Amen in the comments.